The piece of work that's come to be known as network capability is driven by a challenge that Ofgem gave us back in December 2018. They asked us to demonstrate that we can actually measure the capability of the gas transmission network, demonstrate that we understand the needs of our stakeholders and what they want to do, and demonstrate how the business plan submission that we've put in links to the delivery of that service. They've given us this challenge in the context that there's very limited information that's available at the moment to measure the physical capability and do the comparison in this way. Existing data can be measured by something called a capacity baseline obligation. That's a representation of the maximum amount of flow that as gas transmission we're obliged to try to facilitate or sell to the market on a daily basis. The chart in front of you shows that from the year 2000 out to the current time, and then using the forecast of the future energy scenarios, it shows the range of peak supplies that we've seen coming into the network throughout history, and then what that forecast level of supplies is in the future energy scenarios. This can be compared with that peak level of flow that we're obliged to offer up for sale every day. And as you can see, there's a gap between those two numbers, even though there was an uptake in the peak level of flow from 2016. So that has legitimately led to the question, is the gas transmission network still the right size in order to meet the needs of stakeholders going forwards? And the other assets that are associated with our network are about more than peak flow. So let's stay at St Fergus up there in Scotland. That level, that dark blue line on the previous chart, was set at 154 million cubic metres a day. That's just the level of the way that we measure the amount of gas that can come into the network. The peak level of demand that you would see in winter is 60 million cubic metres per day in Scotland, and that includes the exports out to Ireland. That means we've got to transfer about 94 million cubic metres of gas out of Scotland across that 24-hour window, and we do that using the pipes and the compression that we use to make sure that we can move the gas around the network. So that's that peak level of flow that you could see based on the previous chart. Go to a typical summer, or a summer as it was in 2012, and we had quite low amounts of gas coming in at that St Fergus terminal, down at about 20 million cubic metres a day. Compare that with demand, it was about at the same level, and actually the gas coming in and going out of Scotland was broadly in balance. And that happened at a time of low national demand, which is what you see during the summer. So that means that capability is not required, right? Well, no, because if we go to summer 2016, we saw some really significant flows coming in, over 100 million cubic metres into the St Fergus terminal. That demand was only about 20 million cubic metres, and that meant that we had to transfer about 85 million cubic metres out of Scotland. And in order to do that, we had to use the pipes and compressors that we had, the same pipes and compressors that are available at that time of winter peak. Only because it's the summer, quite a few of them were out of service because we have to maintain our pipelines and our compressors. So every piece of kit that was available was being used to deliver that transfer of gas out of Scotland, and in order to meet the flows that our customers wanted us to need. So the capability that's in the network that you can measure that is required at peak levels of demand is also required at lower levels of demand. It's all driven by that difference between supplies and demands across the network. And it's very difficult for us to predict exactly where those supplies are going to come in, because the different sources of supply are dependent on the prices, which is all about the global gas market. Is it cheapest to source it from the UK or from Europe or from Norway or from around the world coming in on LNG boats? We can't predict exactly when that's going to happen, but our network does have the flexibility to facilitate those different combinations of supplies and demands. The capability of the network, we've split it up into zones, and these are shown on the map on the screen. Depending on where that supply is coming in, the zones can have different characteristics. So we may have a net supply zone, which is broadly speaking what you would see in Scotland at the moment, where there's more supply coming in than there is demand going out. But perhaps in South Wales, some days it can be a supply zone. Again, we potentially get high flows into Milford Haven, but again, some days we get very low low flows coming into Milford Haven, and it can be a net demand zone. And the changing colours in that chart on the right hand side will show you whether it's a supply or demand zone. We can represent the physical capability using the charts that are in front of you now. The 4 charts represent the 4 different future energy scenarios. And it's important to point out at this point that our July draft business plan was based on the FES 18 document. For future versions, we'll be looking at how we can incorporate the data from FES 19, but the charts in front of you are from FES 18. Along the bottom, the axis is national demand. And up the side, the axis is the entry flow coming into Scotland and the north of the country. So that covers the entry terminals of St Fergus, Barrow and Teesside. And what the team have done is taken those future energy scenarios. They've taken 4 years, 2020, 30, 40 and 2050. And for each of those years, they've looked at lots and lots of different combinations of potential supplies and demands. So for example, if you look at the community renewables and you look at the demand of 400, you'll see there's a dot at about just shy of 100 million cubic metres, and there's one that goes up to 120, and there's lots of dots in between. So there's hundreds of thousands of different combinations of supplies and demands that's included in these dots. The dark blue ones then are from 2020, lighter blue 2030, the sort of grey one from 2040, and then the really light shaded one in the corner is from 2050. And that allows us to get an indication of how stakeholder needs might change into the future. And you can see that those needs are different depending on which of the 4 future energy scenarios may play out. The lines on the chart then, the top black flat line, that is the capacity obligation. That is the aggregation of the amount of flows that we have to offer up for sale every day. The orange line is showing the physical capability of the network on an intact network basis based on the assets that we've got in our July draft business plan. And what you can see from this is that orange line, it goes down slightly in the summer. That's exactly what we would expect based on the fact that there's less demand in the summer and therefore we can move less gas away. You can also see that in this particular area, it's about at the top level of the stakeholder ranges of flows, so there aren't really any flow patterns that are above that level. And what that says and how that links into our business plan is that we have some compressors in Scotland and the north that won't be compliant with emissions legislation by 2030. And we've had to propose a decision as to whether to replace those compressors, whether to close them, or whether to perhaps limit their running hours from 2030 onwards. And based on this data that's shown here, we don't believe that there's a case to keep those compressors open. So the proposal in our business plan is that we will ultimately decommission those compressors. However, the other compressor stations that we want to keep open do need some work doing on them. And if we take those compressor stations out of service, the level of capability that we've got will go down. So our proposal is that we do the work that we need to do on the remaining compressor stations that are there on an enduring basis during the early years of RIIO-2, and that will subsequently enable us to decommission those other compressor units towards the end of either RIIO-2 or early RIIO-3. And we'll be able to use this type of framework to help us to understand the right timing of that decision. So I'm going to move on now to another part of the country. Chart is, again, it's exactly the same format, but what you can see in this chart is that the level of capability that we have on the network is required all the year round. And in some of the future energy scenarios, you see high levels of LNG flows coming in because this is a representation of the gas coming in to Milford Haven. And in some of the future energy scenarios, you see quite high levels, much higher actually than we've got the capability to deliver. It's okay to have dots that are above the line, scenarios that are above the line. We haven't invested in our network to have infinite capability to meet all scenarios, and we already carry a risk that if there are high flows in the summer in South Wales, we won't be able to meet that all of the time. But what we do need to do, again, is we need to make decisions on whether to invest in compressors that deliver this capability. And given that in all of those scenarios there are high flows, at high levels of demand, and in most of those scenarios there's that requirement there in lower levels of demand, the investments that we need to make to keep that level of capability at the same level past our investment needs case. So these charts support the continued investment in our compressors going forward in South Wales. Exit. This is the demand that's taken off the network. Again, similar format. You can see how the stakeholder levels of flow change into the future in the different scenarios. It's really important to note that going back to that obligation we've got to deliver a network that can facilitate demand that will only be exceeded 1 year out of 20. We always take the worst case scenario when it comes to planning to meet that level of demand. And in this case, you can see that that's in the steady progression scenario. There are two scenarios where the level of demand goes down. We note that, but we have to plan for that worst case, because if we start to reduce our capability and we got the wrong scenario, then we wouldn't necessarily be able to meet our license obligation. We already take a lot of things into account, and that's already included in the analysis that's gone into the production of our July draft business plan. So we take those forecast flows into account, we look at our potential pressure levels and the obligations that we've got, we look at our gas transmission licence obligation, which is driven by the Gas Act, in order to have a network that can meet a level of demand that will only be exceeded 1 year in 20. We look at long-term forecasts. We use the future energy scenarios looking out to 2050 and the different potential ranges of supplies and demands in those. We look at how our customers want to change their mind, what profiles they might want to see across the day, both again on the supply and demand side, and we try to understand what the drivers of that change are going to be, such as a more variable electricity market causing different profiles for gas-fired power stations. We look at the asset data we have, what assets are available, when do we need to maintain them, how reliable are they. We look at all the commercial arrangements that we've got in place and how we can use the different tools associated with that. We look at how we can transfer gas across the network, and we're obviously very conscious of our environmental obligations. So there's a lot of things that are already taken into account in this July draft business plan. These are the metrics that we've put in place. We'd love to hear your feedback as to whether the metrics, the way that we've visualised them, the way that we're talking about them make sense, give you sufficient information either to understand whether you can support the business plan or what extra information you need in order to be able to support that July business plan, whether it gives you a step in the right direction on understanding how things fit together, and what other information might you need. So please get in touch with us to let us know what you think. The how to get in touch is coming up on the next slide.